When the train finally slowed, no one in the cattle car moved. The German prisoners had spent the last 8 days expecting the worst. Every rumor they had heard on the way across the Atlantic had fed the same image into their minds. Barbed wire, searchlights, guard towers, barking dogs, and cold-faced men with rifles waiting to punish them for losing. So when the doors slid open and sunlight poured in, the prisoners hesitated. A Canadian sergeant standing outside lifted a clipboard and called out in calm, almost bored English, "Out you come! Bring your kit if you've got it." No shouting, no threats, no rifle butts banging against the wagon. The prisoners glanced at one another. Otto Weiss, a former corporal from Hamburg, was the first to jump down. His boots hit packed dirt. He looked around quickly, expecting the rest of the camp to reveal itself beyond the station, but what he saw made him stop cold. There were barracks, yes, low wooden ones, a cookhouse, a medical hut, a shed stacked with firewood, a line of wash barrels glinting in the afternoon sun. But there were no walls, no towers, no coils of barbed wire, and, most shocking of all, no fence. Otto stared so hard his eyes watered. Behind him, another prisoner dropped from the train and nearly walked into his back. "What is it?" the man asked. Otto didn't answer at first. He just pointed. Within minutes, dozens of German prisoners stood in the dirt yard, bags at their feet, all turning their heads in disbelief, like men who had stepped into the wrong place. One of them finally whispered in German, "Where is the camp?" Another answered, "This is the camp." That caused a ripple of nervous laughter. But no one truly found it funny, because they all saw the same thing: open land. The camp sat in a wide Canadian valley with dark pine trees in the distance and low blue hills rolling under a pale sky. A dirt road led out toward a nearby town. Beyond the barracks, there was nothing to stop a man from walking straight into the woods. A tall blonde prisoner named Dieter muttered, "You mean we can just walk?" A Canadian guard, no older than 25, heard him. He turned and shrugged. "You can walk around campgrounds," he said. "Don't go making trouble." Dieter blinked. "No fence?" The guard looked genuinely puzzled, as if the question were strange. "Don't need one?" That answer unsettled them more than anger would have. The prisoners were lined up, counted, and shown their sleeping quarters. The barracks were plain, but clean. Each bunk had folded blankets. There was a stove in the center. A handwritten schedule hung near the door. Mealtimes, work details, wash rotations, medical checkups. Nothing about punishment. Nothing about confinement. Nothing about what would happen if they ran. That evening at supper, the Germans sat at long wooden tables and ate thick stew, bread, and boiled potatoes. No one complained. No one joked. Even the men who had spent months grumbling in other camps were quiet now. Finally, Otto leaned across the table toward Dieter. "This is wrong," he whispered. Dieter tore a piece of bread. "What part?" "All of it." He lowered his voice further. "No fence means they are certain we cannot escape." "Why?" Otto glanced toward the windows beyond which the dark tree line rested like a wall of shadow. "Because of the wilderness, or snow, or distance, or because every person here would recognize us in 5 minutes." Across from them, an older prisoner named Franz shook his head. "No," he said. "It is worse than that." They looked at him. He swallowed and said quietly, "It means they think they don't need to frighten us." The words sat heavily at the table. That night, few men slept well. Every creak of the barracks sounded like a test. Every gust of wind against the walls felt like a trick. More than one prisoner got up in the darkness to peer through the window and confirm the same impossible sight. Nothing but open ground under moonlight. By the second week, the strange reality had settled in. The prisoners worked in supervised groups, cutting timber, repairing roads, unloading supplies, and helping on nearby farms during harvest. Guards were present, but not in the way the Germans expected. Many of them carried rifles slung over their shoulders, but spoke with ordinary conversational voices. One afternoon, Otto and 4 others were assigned to load sacks of grain behind a farm outside camp. The nearest guard stood 50 yards away, smoking a cigarette and chatting with the farmer. Dieter stopped lifting for a moment and looked toward the open field, stretching west. "You see that?" he said. Otto kept working. "I see it. No one would stop us for at least a minute." Otto said nothing. Dieter wiped his forehead. "We could be in those trees." "And then?" Dieter didn't answer, because they all knew what came after the trees. Hundreds of miles of cold country, strange towns, unfamiliar roads, and English everywhere. Even if someone avoided capture for a day or two, what then? No papers, no winter gear, no map, no allies. Still, the idea of simply walking away gnawed at men who had spent too long behind doors. That evening, the rumor spread through the barracks that one prisoner from another work crew had tried it. He hadn't run dramatically. He hadn't fought anyone. He had just drifted off near a logging path and disappeared into the pines. The camp buzzed with it all night. Some said he'd make the U.S. border within weeks. Others said he'd freeze. 2 days later, the answer arrived by truck. The missing prisoner sat in the back beside 2 Canadian soldiers, wrapped in a blanket and looking more embarrassed than rebellious. His boots were soaked. His face was pale. He had made it less than 20 miles before reaching a small store, exhausted and hungry, where he tried to buy food using German coins. The shopkeeper had offered him soup, then calmly telephoned the authorities. When the truck stopped, the returned prisoner climbed down on his own. Every German in the yard watched, expecting a public beating or days in isolation. Instead, the camp commandant met him at the steps. The commandant was a broad man with gray at his temples and a winter coat buttoned neatly to the throat. He studied the prisoner for a moment, then asked, "Did you enjoy your walk?" A few Canadian guards smirked. The prisoner stared at the ground. "No, sir." "You hungry?" "Yes, sir." The commandant turned to a corporal. "Get him something hot from the kitchen, then put him back on his regular duty tomorrow." The Germans were stunned. No screaming, no humiliation, no savage example made of him. Later that night, the barracks were louder than Otto had ever heard them. "They are pretending," one man insisted. "They want us calm. They want the farms working. They want us to trust them." Franz, sitting on his bunk, polished his spectacles on his sleeve and said, "Perhaps?" Otto looked at him. "You don't believe that?" Franz set the spectacles back on his nose. "I believe," he said slowly, "that this country is so large and so certain of itself that it does not need to shout." Weeks became months. The camp remained open. The guards remained watchful, but unhurried. Winter came early, blanketing the valley in white, so bright it hurt the eyes. The lack of fences somehow seemed even more unbelievable against the snow. The camp looked less like a prison than a remote village dropped into the wilderness. One morning, Otto was part of a woodcutting crew when a local boy, maybe 10 years old, approached with his father's sled. The boy stared openly at the Germans, then asked one of the guards, "Are these the prisoners?" The guard nodded. The boy frowned. "They look like regular men." No one answered. Otto carried those words for days. At first he hated them. Then he feared them. Then quietly, he began to understand them. He had arrived in Canada expecting monsters to guard monsters. That was the only kind of world war made sense in. But the camp without fences confused everything. It forced men to live in a space where fear alone could not organize every thought. One Sunday after chapel, Otto stood outside the barracks with Franz and watched smoke drift from the cookhouse chimney into the pale sky. Franz said, "You know why there are no fences?" Otto gave a dry laugh. "Because no one gets far." That too. Franz folded his hands behind his back, but mostly because the fence is not here. He tapped the side of his head. It is here, in the distance, in the language, in the winter, in the knowledge that a man cannot cross a continent on pride. Otto looked across the open snow toward the road. "And yet," he said, "it still feels strange." Franz smiled faintly. "Of course it does. A locked gate is simple. An open one forces a man to think." By the spring thaw, the Germans had stopped talking about the missing fences every day. But they never truly forgot them. New prisoners arriving by train always reacted the same way. They stepped onto Canadian soil. They searched for wire. They found none. And then came that same stunned silence, that same frozen expression, as if the absence of a barrier were more powerful than any wall. Years later, long after the war had ended, Otto would remember many things, only vaguely. The bitter wind, the rough blankets, the smell of pine sap on work details, the crunch of snow under borrowed boots. But one moment remained sharp as glass, the train door opening, the sunlight spilling in, the first look at the camp, and the terrible, baffling realization that no one had built a fence because no one thought one was necessary. For a man raised on orders, walls, and warnings, that was more unsettling than barbed wire ever could have been. Because for the first time in years, he had looked at an open road and understood that freedom was not always the same as escape.